All right, can you believe it? We're at the very end. So this is our last video for this course on evangelism and mission. So let's just go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about small groups, types of small groups. There are different types of small groups. There are a discipleship group could be part of a small group strategy. You got accountability groups. You have support groups, men's and women's groups. We have open groups. Sunday school is a type of small group. There's nothing wrong with Sunday school. The only problem that I see with Sunday school is it just limits the size of your church because you have to keep building buildings for rooms. But it is an effective way of doing church for some people. Prayer groups, cell groups, and then you have what we call seeker small groups. Now let's talk about some of the pitfalls of having small groups. These are the not so good reasons for having a small group. You don't want to do it just because they're the newest trend in church growth. Now, for some of you, you might think, what in the world are you talking about? Well, years ago, most churches had Sunday school. They didn't have small groups. And so the newest trend was to have small groups. Oh, we got to have small groups because everybody else has small groups. Well, no, you want to do it. That's not the reason to do it. You don't want to do it just to boost church attendance, although it possibly can. You don't want to do it just because there's too much time on your hands. You don't want to do it because the staff has too much time on their hands, and you don't want to do it because many have already expressed interest. That's not the reason to do small groups. The reason we want to do small groups is because of life change. And the reason why we want to have it is because God's purpose in creation because of God's purpose in creation and redemption. That's why we want to have it. We want to have it because God created you to be in relationships. Jesus came to restore relationships. Jesus prayed that his church would develop the same oneness he experienced in the Trinity. The reason for small groups is because his Spirit is now working to be about his oneness. And because the small group ministry follows what Jesus did. He started with 3. He had the 3, then he had the 12, and then he had the 72. Jesus did not come to reach people through mass evangelistic programs, although he did speak to large groups. But that was not his model. Instead, he gathered a small group of disciples so that he could transform the lives of many. In Acts chapter 20, it says, "You know that I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you and have taught you publicly from house to house." In Acts chapter 2, it talks about how day by day, attending the temple together, they broke bread in their homes and they received their food with gladness and generous hearts. This is what we would call small group ministry. Because small group ministry is also the model that provides the one necessary setting for what we call the one another's. Love one another. You see the verses those are there. And then you have live in harmony with one another. Then we're to welcome one another. Then we're to instruct one another, and then we're to comfort one another. All right, let's look at some of the reasons, again, why we should do discipleship. First, we're to teach and admonish one another. So we're to teach and admonish one another. Number 2, we are to encourage and build up one another. And then number 3, we're to do good to one another. And then number 4, to exhort one another. And then finally, consider how to stir up one another with love and good deeds. So let's go back through these. Number 1, teach. This is in Colossians 3:16. Teach and admonish one another. Encourage and build up one another is in 1 Thessalonians 4:18, 5:11, and also in Hebrews 10:25. To do good to one another is in 1 Thessalonians 5:15. To exhort one another is in Hebrews 3:13, and then consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds is in Hebrews 10:24. What are some of the characteristics that we need to have of discipleship? First of all, we want to confess our sins to one another. James 5:16 says that. We want to pray for one another. James 5:16 also says that. In 1 Peter 4:19, it says we want to show hospitality to one another. And in 1 Peter 5:5, it says we want to clothe ourselves in humility. Now, another reason why the small group ministry is so important in discipleship specifically is because small group model is the only way to practically achieve the goal of every member ministry that's seen in Hebrews 10:24 and 25 and in Ephesians 4:1-6. Genuine fellowship isn't a crowd of 200 or 2,000. That's why we need to have more small groups so that Christians can get together and develop intimate relationships where they can grow and be known. A church model following a biblical model will not have just small groups. It will be merely offer small groups. It will be built with small groups. So small group ministry isn't something we just do. It is part of the lifeblood of the church. Now let's look at the difference between having small groups, being a church with groups, and a church of groups. A church with groups helps people find their place, centralized placement, reactive leaders, curriculum chosen by the leader, low authority of church over the group, group-based evangelism is possible, low monitoring of groups. Whereas a church of groups, they build community, they have group invitation, a shepherd leader, the curriculum is recommended by the church, it's low authority of church over the group, a group-based evangelism is encouraged, and high monitoring of a group. All right, the church is model. This is primarily expression of the church. The groups are assigned by geography, and the group is responsible for enlisting people. You have pastor shepherd leaders. The curriculum is designated by the church. The group-based evangelism and high monitoring of those groups. A church with groups equals turf wars. A church of small groups is a church, a network of smaller communities within the church. The church is small groups. The group is my church. Now, one of the best examples I saw of that was when I heard Pastor Bill Hybels talking about how a couple came up after church and they had this deformed baby, and they were talking about how their pastor had taken care of them, and they kept mentioning the name of this pastor, and Bill Hybels was the senior pastor of this church and didn't know who this pastor was. He thought, who in the world is this? Do we have a new staff member I don't know about? Well, it turns out they were talking about their small group leader. So we need, as disciple leaders, we need to know that small groups are pastors, and that's why it's so important for that. So we're going to talk more about that in class, on our last class. Also, you need to be here because we're going to talk about how to take care of yourself in discipleship. I've really enjoyed this class and hope that these have been helpful to you.